Reading is taken from the New Testament, from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 to 6. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of the darkness," who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The second reading is taken from the New Testament, from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verses 2 to 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, happy Valentine's Day, everyone. But I'm not really going to talk about that. We're going to be focusing on something a little bit different. Of course, it is related to love, and the most perfect love, that of God for us. But I wonder what you make of our gospel reading. What stands out for you? And it's a pity we haven't got time to join into our breakout rooms now and share your reactions to this account of Jesus's transfiguration. Personally, it doesn't matter how many times I've read it in the past, I end up with something new to learn from it. And this time, for me, it threw up a number of unanswered questions that we may never be able to resolve this side of Jesus' second coming. I'll give an example of what I mean. Jesus only took 3 of his disciples with him. Well, what were the others doing? Did they feel excluded? Did they quiz the 3 later on? And how did they cope with the fact that Peter, James, and John wouldn't give anything away? And how did they feel after the resurrection when they were allowed to hear the full story? Now, I could imagine that Peter had to choose his moment. Oh, by the way, brothers, do you remember when we were travelling around the villages of Caesarea Philippi and Jesus asked us who others thought he might be and what we thought? And I said that Jesus was the Messiah. And then he told us not to tell anyone. Well, 6 days later, you'll never guess what happened when he took James, John and me up to the top of the mountain. Maybe it went something like that. Today, nothing seems to remain secret for very long. Anything and everything can make the news or to be reported on social media. And I just mentioned recently, for example, we had the parish council fiasco that went viral, didn't it? Some of you saw that. And I'm sure that in first century Palestine, the authorities had people reporting back to them about what Jesus was up to. And maybe one such reporter or spy caught a whisper that there'd been some mysterious goings on at the top of Mount Tabor. He may have hung around the crowd of followers trying to get something to report back to his boss, possibly the leader of the synagogue in Capernaum. But he fails. All he gets is a no comment. And perhaps he concludes that it was a non-event, or just hopes that his boss doesn't find out and think he's falling down on the job. But the thing is, it wasn't a non-event, far from it. It revealed Jesus' full divinity and glory at a moment in his ministry when his closest followers were trying to get to grips with understanding who he was. It appears in all 3 synoptic gospels, in other words, Matthew, Mark and Luke, but not in John, which might be a bit of a surprise because he's reported as having been there. But he deals with it differently. It's subtly integrated into the prologue of his gospel in chapter 1. And that the prologue is part of a sort of an introduction or overview that sets the scene for the rest of his gospel. And John writes in verse 14, "And the word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's son, full of grace and truth." The transfiguration wasn't the only time the disciples saw for themselves God's glory reflected in and through Jesus. A few weeks ago, our gospel reading was the wedding feast of Cana. And at the end of the story that we heard, verse 11 said this: "Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him." Now, you might want to spend a bit of time this week, perhaps going through and seeing if you can find other places where his glory was revealed in the Gospels. But let's just recap on what actually happened up that mountain. Jesus singled out 3 of his disciples to go with him to pray. It was probably Mount Tabor, but it might have been Mount Hermon, which is much nearer, closer to Caesarea Philippi. But whilst we might speculate, we can't be sure why he left the other 9 behind. He was transfigured right in front of them. And what did that mean? In other words, his appearance was radically changed. He shines. His clothes become dazzling white. The account in Matthew's Gospel describes it like this: "His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light." The disciples saw him in conversation with 2 men, Elijah and Moses, both major prophets from the tribe of Levi, and both of whom were taken up to heaven at the end of their lives. It is thought that Moses represents the law and Elijah the prophets. But what amazes me, it's another one of those things that struck me and I read it again, is that the disciples recognized who they were. They seemed to know who they were. It doesn't say that Jesus introduced them and said, This is Moses and this is Elijah. They seem to know. So we're told that the three disciples were terrified. But true to form, Peter felt the need to speak out. He may have thought the presence of Moses and Elijah herald the end time, before which, according to Jewish tradition, they were expected to return in some way. He suggested that they build 3 booths, rather like the dwellings at the Feast of Booths, which commemorates the Exodus and looks forward to the time of Israel's deliverance. But before Jesus can even respond to him, they were suddenly enveloped in low cloud, and a voice called out, interrupting Peter, maybe even rebuking him. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. This was a second divine endorsement of Jesus' sonship, very like at his baptism. The next minute there was silence, and the 3 disciples were left alone with Jesus. As we heard, on their way down the mountain, he firmly ordered them not to tell anyone until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So I asked myself, if they were not to tell anyone about this yet, why did they witness this event? Well, I'd like to suggest that we need to perhaps look at what happened just before this in the Gospel. Earlier on, I made reference to that pivotal passage in Mark chapter 8, where Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah. This is followed by Jesus teaching about what will happen to him. And we can see the transformation as a visual and verbal verification of this claim to be the Son of Man, who will come in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. That's Mark 8, verse 38, if you want to look it up. So these to me are 3 key things. Peter recognizes that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus makes his claim to be the Son of Man and explains what will happen to him. And his claim is confirmed by God through his transfiguration. Thereafter in Mark, Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem, where he will face suffering and death, and 3 days later his resurrection, his ultimate glorification as God's Son. The transfiguration is a foretaste of what is to come. So even though we've unpicked this story yet again, I hope that you've discovered something new. With all scripture, we need to reflect on how it impacts on our lives and our relationship with God. And I want to finish, it's a bit of a long finish, but bear with me, by considering 2 possibilities. First of all, whilst the disciples were instructed not to tell anyone straight away, the intention was not that the transformation of Jesus became forgotten and irrelevant. During his ministry, Jesus told the disciples several times not to reveal what they had seen and heard until after his resurrection. But from then on, from that point, the disciples were expected to share it widely, to proclaim the good news to everyone. There was no longer a need to keep these details hidden. This is true for us too. We're called to proclaim the good news. We cannot ignore the responsibilities that come with discipleship, even when we feel ill-equipped or lack confidence or feel it's something that somebody else ought to do. We have to hold on to the fact that we are empowered to do this through the light of Christ in us. In the Corinthians reading, Paul reminded us of of that duty. But I want to read you the Message version, perhaps to help us with understanding it. It says this: remember, this is verse 5, our message is not about ourselves. We're proclaiming Jesus Christ, the Master. All we are is messengers, errand runners from Jesus for you. In verse 6 of our Corinthians reading, Paul reminds us that God has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Again, let's hear how the Message puts it. Our lives filled up with light as we saw and understood God in the face of Christ, all bright and beautiful. I'll say again, our lives filled up with light as we saw and understood God in the face of Christ, all bright and beautiful. And this leads on to my second point. If God revealed himself to us through Christ, such that our lives have been filled up with his light, then we must have been transformed in some way. We cannot, I don't believe anyway, we cannot be filled with God's grace and remain the same. We're not like those described by Paul in verses 3 and 4 that choose to deny Christ and prefer to rely on their own strength and live only by worldly standards. It's God revealing himself which transforms us, and he goes on transforming us. That's if we let him. That's the rub, if we let him. We have that choice. He can go on working in us because his love and grace have no limits. So living in the light of Christ means that we accept that God will continue that transformation in us. This was why Jesus came, to change and transform, to make us a new people. It's through Jesus that we see the glory of God. And as disciples, we should reflect the light of Christ within us so that others too can get a glimpse of his glory. Signs of his grace working in us can transform the lives of others as they witness how we behave and live our lives. We are coming to the end, I promise you. Lent starts this week, and this might be a good time to let God continue that transforming process. You could follow one of the many Lent online courses or join one of our parish home groups. Maybe read the book. I've started the one recommended by Justin Welby called Living His Story by Hannah Steele. Or you might want to join in some of the other parish events. But what you have to ask, we all have to ask ourselves, what will we do this Lent to let God transform us?
Lord, let your glory fall as on that ancient day. Songs of enduring love, and in your glory came. And as a sign to you that we would love the same, our hearts will sing that song. God, let your glory come. So we sing, Lord, you are good. You are good, you are good, and your love endures. Yes, you are good, and your love endures. For you are good, and your love endures today. voices in unison, giving you thanks and praise, joined by the instruments, and then your glory came. Your presence like a cloud upon that ancient day. The priests were overwhelmed because your glory came. You are good. You are good. You are good, and your love endures. Yes, you are good. You are good, and your love endures. Yes, you are good. You are good, and your love endures today. A sacrifice was made, and then your fire came. They knelt upon the ground, and with one voice they praised. Sacrifice was made, and then your fire came. They knelt upon the ground, and with one voice they praised. But Lord, you are good. Yes, you are good. You are good, and your love endures. Yes, you are good. You are good, and your love endures. Yes, you are good. You are good, and your love endures today. But Lord, you are good, we sing together. But you are good, and your love endures. Yes, you are good, and your love endures. Yes, you are good,